Good morning, everybody. I would like to start by thanking warmly the Bilgi University and the RESAID project for having me here today. It's an honor to be with you. And my intention, since I was granted for a quite long time of speaking time, I would like to perhaps recap on certain basic fundamental concepts that replace the whole discussions around countering disinformation in its proper context and recalling the objectives, the policies that have been set up, in particular in the European Union, what they are and what they are meant to achieve. This is very important in my view today, because we are assisting since few months to a quite strong reaction towards research around disinformation, against fact-checking, basically around all the initiatives that were set up during the last years that are increasingly accused, particularly after the change in the US administration, of being activities that are quashing this freedom of speech. So I will use this concept of freedom of speech and the limitation of the scope of the action to counter disinformation as a key note for my introductory speech today. In essence, I would like to, switch slide. Yeah, I would like with this first concept. What is disinformation? We always talk about disinformation, but what do we really mean? It's a complex concept, and I think it's important to unpack it to start with. And it works. If you look at what the European Digital Media Observatory is doing since a couple of years, the European Digital Media Observatory is tracking narratives, in particular, disinformation narratives. So what we look at, it is the prevalence of certain narratives based on a fact-checking methodology, and we track, in particular, a number of recurring themes which revolve around health, in particular COVID-19, that is still present in the information space. We cover the narratives against the European Union, the policies of the European Union, the Israel-Hamas conflict, the LGBTQ stories around diversity and inclusion, if you want to put it in a wider form, the conflict in Ukraine, of course, that it is extremely present. Climate change and immigration are classic topics which are a constant target of disinformation stories across the space, in all and across countries. Yeah, but what does it mean build up a monitor of disinformation narratives? What do we mean by disinformation? I'll start with an old, now oldest, from 2017 categorization that was made by Claire Wardle and Verasken, that basically used the concept of intent in order to distinguish different forms of disinformation disorders. So you have false content that can be qualified as either means of disinformation, where the dividing line is the presence of an intent to mislead, an intent to cause public harm. Whereas other information disorders, where the presence to cause harm it is proven, may not contain false content. So in the case of harassment, for instance, or in case of malicious leaks, you may very well distribute information that is correct, that it is factually correct, but it is distributed, disseminated against the will of the author of that information with an intent to cause harm to that particular person group. So the phenomenon is quite complex, and from the policy and legal point of view, it is important to keep in mind this distinction. Not the other way. No, no, again. All right. So let me, as an example, give you some elements, some examples of disinformation that is typically taken into account in the analysis of disinformation narratives, right? What we look at first of all, whether the content is manipulated, clearly manipulated. In that example, that was an example from 24th of February 2022, the day after the invasion, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops. This video was circulated quite widely on Facebook with the subtitles that were not corresponding to the words said by President Joe Biden, the then President Joe Biden. The subtitles were suggesting that nothing was happening. So that is a clear manipulation, no? of the content, the subtitles. The next example, if I can move on, is about another typical cases of manipulative content. One, it is the false context. That it is quite a classic. That refers to a gathering that was wrongly attributed to an event revolving around the figure of Greta Thunberg. And the picture is clearly depicting a stadium, public space, littered all across, dirty. And the caption of this image was to suggest that climate activists were in fact leaving behind them a lot of litter, a lot of dirt. So what is in it for, in terms of coherence? In fact, that is not a picture taken from an event, right, or around Greta Thunberg. It is simply what happens after a rock concert. So that was a rock concert. So that it is an image, it is true, but it's taken out of context. The other one is it's a deep fake. That it is raising concern in terms of manipulation of information. Deep fakes are quite detectable when it comes to pictures, videos. You can reverse engineer in different ways, or even with your eyes detect imperfections in videos that suggest that that particular piece of content is synthetic and is therefore a deep fake. But with audio content, it's much more difficult. And that was an example where during the last year in 2023, when there was the presidential election in Slovakia, Michael Sucha, that is the person representing the picture, was wrongly accused to have been discussed with a journalist, and the audio was allegedly recorded, about the way to rig the upcoming presidential elections. So that is a classic case of deepfake in an audio format that has been quite difficult to detect indeed. And the next one, that it is, but there are not only deep fakes, there are also cheap fakes. And the cheap fakes are those situations where quite easily you can put an audio on the top of the real image, but simply altering what is said. That is a press conference that was given in the past by Karine Jean-Pierre, who was the spokesperson of Joe Biden. And the alteration of that press conference consisted in pretending that a journalist was asking a question regarding the fact that Ukrainians are neo-Nazis, and with Karine Jean-Pierre replying in a very evasive way, saying that, well, you know, US and Ukraine were fighting during the World War II against Russia, against Stalin, which of course it is an historical falsehood. But that didn't require very sophisticated means. That was a cheap fix. It was enough to, you know, in fact, if you observe the movement of the lips do not coincide with the words that are spoken. But, you know, it can work. The next piece. More intriguing and more pernicious, I would say, it is those cases where disinformation is spread through imposter websites. So websites that mimic authentic news outlets. In this example, you see Repubblica, which is one of the main Italian newspapers, and the website is repubblica.it, not IN. And Le Parisien, very popular outlet in France, where in fact the website is leparisien.fr, not WF. But people do not pay attention to these details and therefore believe that the content it is authentic, which is not. And in that way, you can actually make your audiences believe that in a reputable newspaper, it is in fact, you know, distributing reliable news. People can rely on about things that are, you know, inflammatory, like Brussels skills, or you know, there is the wave of immigrants that will destroy the country. Strong language and based on stories that are not necessarily corresponding to any verifiable fact. The next one. So imposter content, it is increasingly used, and in fact, the concept that I would like to really emphasize in this context is that this information, it is not only about deciding whether the content is false or not, or truthful. It is more to look at the whole cycle through which a message is created and distributed. It's normally a combination of false or misleading content and a manipulative behavior. That it is very important to keep in mind. And Claire Wardle again made a kind of a graph. The credits for this infographic is for her. And in a very simple scheme, you can identify the creation stage where somebody, obscure person, create content that has an inflammatory intent, right? It is produced through a network of websites that are bogus websites that are a mimic existing reputable news outlets, or simply are created just for the purpose of posting content under the form and shape of a media outlet, using the appearance of a media outlet. And then it's distributed, so normalized through social media, for instance, in Facebook. So they get traction with the audience that otherwise they will not be aware of the existence of these websites. They get aware of the existence of these websites and believe that the websites are real news outlets through the use of social media, Facebook. That is a phase of normalization, which leads to reproduction. Reproduction means that there is an engagement after the one of those who have contributed to the creation of this network of false websites has posted links that leads people to those resources, to those internet resources. Then, of course, there is an engagement, and that is where it gains functions. And that is quite an interesting thing, that because you can find actors that you can suspect. So the those who belong to the same community of disinformers, yes, of course. There are political sympathizers, but that could be, for instance, the Trump supporters, right? There could be external supporters from other countries, like in the case of Russian trolls, but sometimes we are so eager to debunk that we could even create the opposite effect to give more oxygen and visibility to these stories. That happened, for instance, in the past, when Hillary Clinton tried to, raise awareness about the existence of this particular technique, and by doing that, contributed even more to make people aware that this website existed, and not everybody that was exposed to those websites was actually believing that the content was false or misleading and malicious in its own intents. They thought that was real. So it's very tricky, let's say. And the reproduction phase entails also consideration in terms of communication strategies. What is the best way in order to prevent the further amplification of this content? So thinking to do good, we may be wrong and do actually the opposite, with a boomerang effect that was not your simple intentions. So again, it is the concept basically, it is that disinformation is fundamentally a form of manipulation of the information and communication infrastructures. It's not about to decide what is true, what is false. It's about to intercept, detect, and expose techniques that are used online in order to give more visibility to certain contents to the detriment of other legitimate content. So the balance in terms of exposure, it is tilted in favor of those obscure, covert techniques that distort the distribution process of information. And that can be there can be two ways. I mean, we need to make a distinction here between tactic, techniques, and procedure that are used by third parties, like those who create these networks of website, and they have a strategy, they organize a campaign, and they orchestrate an attack, from those distortions that are arising from the systems that the social media platforms have put in place, normally for supporting their economic model, their business model. So on the one side, you have a constant evolution of techniques and tactics that are now taking different names and forms, but it's very changeable. This landscape, the threat landscape, it is extremely dynamic. So for the moment, I mentioned there are some kind of obvious examples, like astroturfing. Astroturfing is when you use bots, fake accounts, false engagements. You purchase engagements to increase the level of popularity of certain content, and therefore to amplify the distribution, because the algorithms and platforms give prominence to content that is popular. And you create the impression that there is a wide popular support around the narrative, which is not the case, because in fact there are bots and fake accounts that repeat over and over the same stories in different forms and shapes, but the same story. So astroturfing. Disinformation for hire is coming more and more prominent on stage. So you hire PR agencies that in turn hire influencers, different types of influencers, and they use these channels in order to reach wide audiences with the content that is, of course, has been pre-cooked and designed in order to achieve certain political or economical gains. Information laundering. Well, information laundering, it is exactly this type of scheme that was mentioned before under the credit of Claire Wardle, but has been evolving over time. The most powerful campaign in that respect has been the doppelganger campaign. So we are talking about hundreds of websites. For example, when the EU took the famous, maybe famous, initiative to block Russia Today and Sputnik, with a lot of discussion about freedom of expression, right? Freedom of press and all the rest. Well, what I'm concerned of is, right or wrong, the decision had not much of an effect, because what happened is that the same content was started to be circulated in 450, 470 websites, popping up like mushrooms, and therefore, you know, showing how difficult it is in the online environment to contain the content that you judge harmful if you do not address the infrastructures that enable the distribution of that content. Eventually, it has been a long process in order to identify, debunk the organization behind propaganda, which was, of course, a troll organization. You can imagine about where it was coming from, but to understand how the mushrooming dynamics were working, how to stop it, but required the intervention of the internet service providers, not simply, you know, the internet service providers decided that in that case, the case being so clear about the existence of a manipulatory intent and the use of resources which were illegitimate in the way they were operating in terms of process, in terms of communication process, that accepted to deplatformize propaganda. Oops, and now it works when it shouldn't. Sponsoring, well, that is very easy. Pay for visibility. Yeah, ads. Cross-platform migration, very interesting. In order to blur the traces of the operation, you jump from one platform to another. In order to, the goal is always the same, to hide the origin of and therefore the authors, the initiators of the campaign. So jumping from one platform to another facilitate a lot this type of occultation of the origins, of the provenance of the content. Hacker leaks, well, hacker leaks, you have a remarkable example in 2017 when Macron went for the first round of presidential elections, and just today, before the second and final ballot on Saturday, when there was the blackout, you know, the electoral blackout, the organization hacked the mailbox of the then Republican March, the party supporting Macron at the presidency election, and used and redistributed as a form of leaks many materials that were real, but injecting in those materials also false emails, alleging, for instance, about you know, complicity in traffic of financing with in Panama and other fiscal paradises. So hacker leaks is also a very clear example of manipulatory technique that is used beyond the truthfulness or the falsehood that is typical of that particular piece of content. That is important to focus on the behavior that is either fraudulent or even illegal. Stolen identities is clear and is becoming increasingly used using the face of the websites of other people in order to do content that has nothing to do with the persons that are attributed the authorship for this content. But in itself, this is illegal as a behavior, irrespective of the judgment that one can bring regarding the content. Actually, and these are the third parties, but of course, as I said, there is also the internal intrinsic distortions that arise from the business model of the platforms, so the algorithms that rank the content, or the recommender systems that show you in the timeline what is the content that you are invited to look at as a matter of priority. There is form of automated content moderation that it prefers with that type of content that it is most emotional in tone and in nature, and therefore creates, due to psychological ties and many reasons, more engagement with the audiences. The audiences stays on the platform, so the longer they stay, the more they're exposed to the advertisement that it is distributed in that platform, and the more they're exposed to advertisement, more things can be claimed in the form of monetization of content, to the advantage, of course, of the platforms themselves. So internal, intrinsic, endogenous distortion, exogenous distortion. But still, we are talking about a distortion of the method of the communication process, irrespective of the falsehood of it. When you combine the two, well, you have disinformation. That is what it is. Disinformation is the combination. Misinformation, it is when there is not this form of deliberate usage, distortive usage of information in communication infrastructures. Misinformation is the distribution of content that it is verifiably incorrect, factually incorrect, but without an intent to mislead. And therefore, once you look at the two things, and now we can go there, the two concepts, of course, you need to keep in mind that this distinction complex in order to decide what it is in the real life scenarios, but it is in any event fundamental to be brought to the attention of those who are moderating content online, because of the problem of balancing the responses, to keep the responses in a proportionate way, in line with fundamental principles. So we can act against deliberate, intentional disinformation with the manipulation of information infrastructure in a different way compared to those situations where, in fact, there is just a falsehood that is spreading, but without an intent. Of course, also the concept of disinformation is not that obvious. There are different levels of harm, different levels of risks that are arising from that. And when we talk about influence operations, which are coordinated campaigns either by domestic or foreign actors that are really deliberately targeting a certain audience with a specific political aim, of course, we are talking about something else that than the game played by the Bailey teenagers back in 2017 that wanted to make money with some advertising monetization and using the captivating pictures and stories completely invented, so that using the system in a way that was distorted, but without much more behind it, but to raise a few $1,000 for them. And at the even deeper level, we have foreign influence operations, so orchestrated by states, and where there's the usage of coercive and deceptive efforts that aim at disrupting the free formation of public opinion, and therefore may take a significant role in wider hybrid operations like we have seen in the Ukrainian conflict in that unfortunate context. So that is the first point I wanted to bring to your attention. The second one that is important now for me, and the second and last, I have not the third or the fourth. I want to reassure you. It is what to do about it. So what it is currently the policy, what has been the approach, at least in Europe, in the European Union, to tackle this phenomenon. A multidimensional approach. Why multidimensional? Well, because there is an important starting point, which I already repeated, There is the need to design responses that are compliant with fundamental rights, in particular freedom of expression. And therefore, you need to put together different ways, different tools to tackle the problem that involve the whole society. You need to have more a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down censorship-like approach if you don't want to trespass a red line. And the three main blocks of the policy developed in the EU are first, of course, improving the capabilities of public institutions. The public institution may intervene, in particular when there are hybrid attacks and hybrid risks at stake. So you need to strengthen the ability to expose, to understand, identify, expose, and counteract against attacks that are really threatening the public order, right? And that is a role for public authorities. But the other things that where public authorities should refrain from intervening, but much more relying on the wider community of researchers, fact-checkers, journalists, media that are independent in their operations, and that it is in two sides. On the one side, in order to understand what the online platforms are actually doing with their own systems, and therefore to make them accountable for the distortion that either allow to happen when third parties exploit the vulnerabilities of their services, as I said before, or because their own business models take precedence over ethics and public interest. On the other side, disinformation is best countered through a boost of reliable, independent, journalistically ethical information. And therefore, the importance of defending media freedom and to engage a number of actors that includes also the civil society and the academia in order to create an enabling environment for freedom of expressions that, let's say, that leads to a higher attention by the public to information that it is produced by professional, reliable, and accountable sources. So freedom of expression, let me pause on this point because I said that disinformation is a combination of false content and manipulative behavior. The false content in itself is not enough to take strong action against it. The fundamental principle that is enshrined in the International Covenant of Political and Civil Rights, in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, in the European Convention on Human Rights, all repeat the same thing, which is that the content, even if it is extreme, inflammatory, disturbing, has the right to exist. It cannot be suppressed. So the right to act against misinformation has to be calibrated in light of the fact that you can not suppress content just because it is not factually correct. You cannot impose remedies that lead to suppression of content just because it's factually correct. However, of course, the freedom of expression is not an absolute principle, despite what Elon Musk continue to repeat. It's not absolute. There are limits. There are limits, and the limits are so designed as to make possible to create an environment where people can exercise their right to receive, not only in part, but also to receive information on which they can rely to freely form their own opinions and to freely participate in the democratic processes. So there is an active and a passive right under the concept of freedom of expression. There is an active right to impart information. And there you can be inflammatory, you can be offensive, you can be extreme as you want. But the passive side of the same right implies that the recipients, the receiver, on the receiving side, you have a right to claim that you want to be able to distinguish, to access and distinguish what is a reliable information on which you can actually critically form your opinions and therefore to act accordingly. So let's say the three blocks. The first one is, improving the capabilities of the public institution. As I said, that is a bit the backbone of the action that is taken at the level of the European Union by the External Action Services that has created a STRATCOM, strategic communication unit, or other, to be more correct, units. There are several of them. The purpose is to enhance strategic communications, to counteract violent communications that should temper the impact of attacks coming from foreign actors, because this is only aimed at foreign interference and hybrid threats. Let's not forget it. And for that, there is a rapid exchange system for exchange of information that is called the Rapid Alert System, that links together member states authorities to facilitate the identification and coordination of countermeasures at the level of the member states. There is a system of collaboration with the like-minded countries in NATO, in G7, plugging the rapid alert system with the rapid response mechanism that it is in the NATO system, and a development of a toolbox, or basically a protocol on how to react that leads to the adoption of countermeasures that could even impose costs on the perpetrators. One example of costs imposed on perpetrators, it is what I referred to before, the decision on the 1st of March 2022, so 1 week after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russian troops, the decision to block Russia Today Sputnik, which has created a lot of, polemics, controversy in Europe in particular, especially when it was then followed up by other similar action against Voice of Europe, against RIA Novosti, against the Rossiyskaya Gazeta, and a dozen of other outlets, media outlets, not bogus website. Those are media outlets that they were simply blacked out, or the broadcasting license was withdrawn. Measures very strong that were, in fact, harshly criticized by the European Federation of Journalists, that was saying that fighting disinformation with censorship is not a good idea. And the debate actually continues. There are still two schools of thoughts in this respect. But that is one pillar. The other pillar is how to make online platforms more accountable. Probably the DSA now is the new actor in town, and the DSA implies, first of all, a basic principle of exemption of liability for online platforms in respect of the content that they host. However, they have now, in general, irrespective of their size, of the size of the platform, an obligation of transparency and also an obligation of remove illegal content. That is not new. That was existed already under the e-commerce directive since 2001, but has been reaffirmed in the DSA. What is new in the DSA is that for very large online platforms and very large search engines, so those who have more than 45 active monthly users in the EU, there is also an obligation to assess on a yearly basis the systemic risks that their service can create, and to take mitigation measures to prevent risks such as, of course, dissemination of illegal content. That is one thing, but also risk that consist in the distribution of harmful but not necessarily unlawful content that could affect the civic discourse, the electoral process, the public order, public security. And this, the blobs, the DLOPs, the large platforms, needs to take mitigation measures and be subject to independent audits in order to verify that the measures actually have an effect. And if they do not comply, they are subject to hefty sanctions that can go up to 6% of the global yearly turnover. So billions and billions in principle, in theory. When you say systemic risk is it's quite a vague concept. So as regards this information, there is the code of practice on this information that was created in 2018 in this first version. And at that time, actually, I was on the side of the Commission that the first code, it was me to negotiate it with the platform, and was the first attempt to bring platforms around the table where they didn't want to sit. It was a very difficult exercise. And now, step by step, the code of practice has been reinforced in 2022. And now, since July, it will become actively a code of conduct under Article 45 of the DSA. So in practice, that would mean that the mitigation measures that the platforms are supposed to take need to reflect what is in the code, whether they have subscribed it or not. If they have subscribed it, of course, they're in a better position to defend themselves because they said those are the commitments that I took, and therefore I'm implementing what I promised. If, like X, they move out, or even like the others have moved out from certain commitments from the code, and therefore now they have only a partial adhesion to the code, well, then where they do not adhere to the code, they need to prove that what they do instead, it is equally effective in order to achieve the objectives that are underlying the measures set out in the code. So they have in essence, in legal terms, there is a switch in the burden of proof. If you subscribe the code, basically it is for the Commission and the enforcers to demonstrate that the measures have not been effective. If you do not subscribe to the code, it is up to you, platforms, to demonstrate that what you do instead, it is sufficiently effective in mitigating the risk. So there is this reversal of the burden of proof. That's why they really don't understand the strategy that the platforms are following right now. That seems to be that looks like they're shooting their feet, honestly. I will go very quickly through, if I still have time, to something that I think quite important. And normally you don't find these 3 slides that will follow in the discussions around the DSA and around the code. I have tried to group the measures, the many measures that are in the code. You know, the code in terms of substantive measures, let alone the procedural measures, but in terms of substantive measures and commitment contains roughly 30 commitments, substantive. But they are not all the same. And it's important to understand the nature of this commitment. If you want to be then compliant with the principle of freedom of expression, taking into account that the concept of these information disorders refers to different situations and concepts that need to be, that requires a modulation in terms of response. So it is, in my view, quite useful to divide the type of measures into 3 categories. One is the measures that are content nature. Other measures you see are a measure that acts at the level of the service, not at the level of the content. And the third category, it is the measures that are content specific. So alert. So the content neutral are quite easy. They don't raise fundamental questions regarding freedom of expression. What are they? The platforms or commitments regarding the provision of tools for users to increase the levels of media literacy, not content specific. not much risk, or the commitment to enter into framework agreements with fact checkers and media literacy organization. That it is a financial support, let's speak frankly, this is financial support for independent organization. It's certain there is nothing to do with the judgment on content, but it is an endeavor to nurture a community that has as its own mission to better understand the phenomenon and to better raise awareness across audiences. So I would not see much problems at that level with freedom of expression, or to grant access to data, to their own data, platforms data, in order to, advance independent research. But again, not content specific, not much risk on infringing fundamental principles. Service level measures. That is very interesting, has been under studied, has been under tested, but still for me is the core of the code of conduct. This is where we should work the most. And those are measures that enhance the findability of online authoritative sources and media by means of trustworthiness indicators. So again, we start from the concept that when you open Facebook, Instagram, the ranking of the content is neutral. That is the, it is a non-editorial agenda, because there is not editorial responsibility. So it's the non-editorial agenda that is perfectly neutral, that reflects the world as it is. It is not true, of course, because it's strongly distorted by economic incentives. But the question is then, how can be rebalanced? So how to give more visibility to trustworthy information sources? Who define what those trustworthy information sources? So hopefully there is the EMFA, European Freedom Media Act, that in Article 18 indicates that each member state has the obligation to list those media service providers that fulfill the self-regulatory rules in order to consider editorial media. So then it could be a reference, Article 18, and the list of media that are registered under that particular provision of the EMFA, that could be the trustworthy sources that could be or should be actually identified into machine-readable signals that are inputted into algorithms and rebalance the prevalence given to other criteria such as popularity and profiling of the users. The second, and again, this is not context specific, there is no issue of freedom of expression there. It is a matter to rebalance the distribution in general, whatever it is. The second one is to provide tools for users to assess the provenance. I mean, as a user, I would like to see what is the source, where it's coming from. So the history, tracking the history of the journey that a piece of content goes through when it's distributed online. Again, the integration of fact checks through the use of warning labels, links to information panels. These provide context. They do not suppress content. They provide more context. So as a user, I would be very interested because I'm in a better position to assess critically the information that I'm exposed to. And that is a facilitator of freedom of expression, since the freedom of expression includes, as I said before, a right to receive, not only part, but receive reliable information. And then give users agency in the use of platform recommender system and AI-driven services. Well, we think that the algorithms is like the Rosetta Stone, that is carved in stone, it cannot modify by reality. These codes, these algorithms change every day. They're tweaked every day. So if they're tweaked every day by engineers that hardly understand what they're doing, because the machine then take over their own capacity to understand the intelligence that it is built into their own LLMs and their own recommender systems that go beyond their understanding and comprehension, well, give users options for them to switch from one architecture to another architecture and compare the distribution of content using those architectures. Give that possibility. I mean, I'd like to see, it's like to switch to zap on the TV from one channel to another and you compare, right? Nothing to do with suppression or compression of freedom of expression there. And then, of course, to give the users more ability to flag the content, but that has to go hand in hand with appeal mechanism, because sometimes flagging it is instrumental to a group that want to act against another group, so you need to have a check and balances in the system. The community notes, the X and now Meta are using, reflects that, but the problem there is there is no appeal mechanism that is really working well. Therefore, it becomes a kind of revenge mechanism for those that are fighting behind the scene between themselves. And finally, content-specific measure. Lot of caution when we enter in this type of measures. So suppressive measures. Well, the code, let's be very clear. The code does not require suppression measures just because the content is blocked. So misinformation can be taken down. Content suppression, it is foreseen only in case of fraudulent or illegal behavior. Impermissible behavior. So all this type of TTPs that are mentioned before. Demonetization, used with care, evidence, systematic use of content in order to pursue the aim to enrich yourself. So there must be a pattern of behavior before you clamp down and demonetize. But a pattern of behavior is difficult to establish right now due to absence to sufficient data from the platform. But if it is established, again, you act against the behavior, not against the content. And the monetization, therefore, has a little risks to infringe freedom of expression because you are attacking a product. Actually, it's like, to say you cannot advertise or dangerous products. This sponsoring of this information, this sponsoring, it is when, honestly, the platforms, you take money from authors, let's call it very widely authors, in order to give more visibility, to raise the ranking of their content. Freedom of expression, well, the freedom of expression that is not really affected there, but has to be very clear in how you do it. It's not affected because you are not in fact removing the content online. You simply refuse or ask the platform to refuse to give extra visibility by taking money that would actually tilt the market for free circulation of ideas in favor of those who have the resources to pay against those who have not the resources to pay. So basically, you can see that as a measure that prevent distortion of competition in the free market for ideas. And the amplification of misleading content, the amplification is content specific. And you see that is a piece of content, you derank it, you demote it, you make it more difficult to find. Let's be clear, you do not remove the content, you make it more hard to find. But I think in those cases, some evidence that of a kind of suspicion of a systematic behavior that connect different pieces of similar content across, therefore there is a suspicion of organized campaign behind, would be necessary in order to be on the safe side. And I think with that, I would like to say two more very quick things, is that all this is fine, beautiful, but reactive measures, you need also to act on the preventive front. So you need to prevent the creation and distribution, and how you do it, of disinformation, and how you do it. Well, strengthening media freedom, strengthening pluralism on one side, engaging a multi-stakeholder community, checking, research, media literacy community, in order to create this virtuous circles that from more freedom leads to better journalism, and through the engagement of the whole of society in this endeavor to restore information integrity, enable cognitive resilience from the recipient side, which will become more active demanders for reliable information that would feed in again into the production of good journalism. Alerted and conscious audiences represent a demand that is now decreasing and demotivate the production of quality journalism. We need to reverse this vicious circle and to make it a virtuous circle. Well, this is what EDMO is trying to do, especially now it's a little bit a final spot for my work. That is an ad for EDMO. And so what we are doing, it is really to connect these communities, fact-checking, researchers, media literacy, to support policy, and to also carry out training and outreach activities to convey the message, but also to create, to facilitate the creation of a more intelligible online information space. We are not alone. It's a quite complex and difficult project because it is built on a central platform. It is where I'm working. I'm the chair of the executive committee of the executive board of the central platform. And around the central platform, there are 14 national hubs spread all over Europe, covering all member states, that act or should act in synchrony and with a consistent vision. This is a work in progress. But we have hopes that in the next cycle that will open up in the next autumn, we enter the new cycle. These linkages, this coordination, this synchronism in vision and actions will further improve, and we will take it from there. Thank you very much.